Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Missouri Foundations of Energy Savings Performance Contracting Training. We're looking forward to having all of you here with us, and we're excited to talk about ESPC with you, so you can all learn a little bit more about this important financing mechanism and how you can leverage it in your own communities to make things happen energy-wise. So before we get started, I have a couple housekeeping things. We are using the Zoom platform. I imagine most of you are probably pretty familiar with this. But if you do have questions while our trainer is giving his presentation, please put them in the Q&A section or in the chat box, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. I think we'll try to have this be a little bit more of a conversation. So please let us know. And we also will have some time for question and answers at the end of this session as well. So before we get started here, I'd like to turn things over to Director Craig Redmond with the Missouri Division of Energy to provide a few opening remarks about ESPC in Missouri. Director Redmond, are you there?
All right, I am, Sam. Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. I am Craig Redmond. I'm the Director of Missouri's Division of Energy. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out today to today's workshop on energy savings performance contracting. We're all about energy efficiency here at the division, and we know that this financing mechanism can create great opportunities for facilities to make those kind of important investments. We're happy to partner with the National Association of State Energy Officials and the Energy Services Coalition to bring you this training today, and we hope that you find it helpful when looking at your own facilities and your own energy needs. Again, thanks everyone for coming out, and I'm going to turn it back over to you, Sam.
All right, thank you so much, Director Redmond. We're going to get started here in just a second with the main portion of our training. I'd like to quickly introduce our trainer here with the Energy Services Coalition. His name is Chris Halpin. He has worked for several premier energy consulting firms and ESCOs in engineering, management, and sales, and is a former global energy manager for NCR. He's a nationally known expert in and acts as an owner's rep for energy savings performance contracts, PPAs, and public-private partnership projects. Since 2000, he's managed over $2.5 billion in energy projects for the federal, MUSH, higher end, and commercial markets. He is currently working on over $500 million of P3 energy resilience projects for several clients. He has a BSME and is a registered PE in 9 states. He's on the Society of American Military Engineers Energy and Sustainability Committee. For 8 years, he was on the board of directors of the Energy Services Coalition, and he's also a technical reviewer for the U.S. DOE Solar Technology Office's Small Business Innovation and Technology Transfer Grant Program. So that's a lot of experience we're bringing to the table here. Really excited to have him here presenting for us. He's going to give us a lot of good information here over the next couple hours. Our second speaker, we will have a Missouri-specific speaker, and his name is Chris Salzman. He is a business development manager with Energy Solutions Professionals. They do a lot of work in Missouri around ESPC, and he'll be providing some perspectives on how it's been working with ESPC in Missouri as well. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to our trainer, Chris. Chris, we're happy to have you get started whenever you're ready.
All right. Thanks, Sam. I appreciate the flowery introduction. Though I have been in this quite a while, since 1985, on the owner side as well as the contractor side, and then for the past 20 years as an owner's representative. So I'm really happy to do this. Want to let everybody know up front, I am actually the understudy here. Dal Howes, who usually makes this presentation, is on vacation this week. So I'm going to do the best job I can of taking over his slide deck and teaching you guys as much as I can in an hour and a half about energy savings performance contracting. And as Sam said earlier, we want to try to make this more of a conversation, so that if you have questions, please put them out there. Sam will pick them up and let me know. And we really want you to come away from this with at least a decent basic working knowledge of what this whole vehicle is, because it's very powerful. And I've been working with states for a couple of decades on this, and it's really helped them a lot, a tremendous amount. So anyway, let's get going. Sam, can you see my slides okay?
Yep, they're coming through on our side.
Okay, great. Okay, so I am going to, whoops. I was going to turn off the camera. Now I don't know how to do it here. Here we go. Okie doke. All right. So one of the things I want to make clear at the very beginning, a copy of these slides from today's presentation will be provided to everybody for reference, because there's a lot of information in some of these slides. And I'm certainly not going to read them all, but wanted to make sure we had a lot of information here so that when you go back and take a look at this, or you share it with others in your office, you'll have some good information there. And feel free, of course, to always follow up. I've got my contact information here. If you have any other questions you think of in a week or two or a month or whatever, please just reach out. Okay, did that slide transition on your side?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm here on behalf of the Energy Services Coalition. I'm currently a consultant to ESC, much like Dale Haas is. I was on the board for many years. As I said, I left last fall, now a consultant. And ESC is a great organization, especially a national nonprofit that's composed of a network of experts from a wide range of organizations, basically state energy officials and people representing other government entities from across the country, as well as representatives from ESCOs, energy services companies, as well as folks from like the firm I used to run, which is an owner's rep firm, and you have vendors and so on, financiers and so on that are all really interested in fostering the use of performance contracting as a very powerful tool for state and local governments to be able to reach their energy efficiency and other goals by using energy savings performance contracting specifically. So what is this? ESPC is the most common name for it. We'll talk a little bit more later about some of the other names it's known under, but ESPC is the most typical name. So it's basically the use of guaranteed savings, and that's in red for a very good reason, right? Because most other either procurement or construction systems and methodologies that are used currently in the US have very little of any guarantees associated with them. You know, if you build a new building, you hire the architect who hires the engineers, you put out the plans to bid, that you hire a construction contractor, they build the building, you have a 1-year period for that warranty, and then that's basically it, right? And there's no guarantees or performance or anything, and the roof can leak, whatever, and you're kind of out of luck. That's one of the nice things and that I really love about ESPC and why I've been with for so long is it really helps government entities have recourse because of this guaranteed savings. And it's savings from your maintenance and operations budget, which includes utilities. So this is everything from paying your electric, gas, and water bills and sewer and so on, to paying outside contractors to maintain equipment for you, repairs, replacing motors, so on and so forth. And it does this in a way, it works really like capital to make these needed upgrade and modernizations to your buildings financed over a specified period of time. So you'll notice, right, that this definition is from the Department of Energy from 1999, right? So this isn't a new concept, and it's been around actually for much longer than that. It was started in the mid 80s. Ohio and Washington State were two of the pioneer states that started doing ESPC, and it's really been a great boon to a lot of states around the country. One of the reasons that this is so popular and that it's so powerful is that you're going to spend this money anyway, right? This is basically money you're currently spending on your electric bill, your gas bill, your water bill, like I had said. And it's basically taking that cost of inefficiency that are in your buildings, and it's typically 20 to 40% on average that these projects are able to save. We like to consider it sort of the froth on the top of your beer in the mug, right? It's you get to drink the beer, you don't get to do much with the froth, and with the energy inefficiency in your building, it's really something that's wasted. So by attacking it using this methodology, it allows you to basically reinvest in those buildings, right? And modernizing them at the same time, right? So which is really powerful, especially these days. We'll talk about this a little bit later. There's a lot of money that's been coming out the past few years, especially with the pandemic, the ESSER and ESSER 2 funding to schools. Now we're starting to see a lot more money coming out to state and local governments through the new bipartisan infrastructure law, which we'll talk about later on. And also reducing the carbon footprint, which is getting more and more important every day. And one of the most important things about this is it creates local jobs, right? Which we know is always needed. Even when the economy is going great, there can always be more jobs. So what is this really, right? And there's a lot of different ways of considering it out there. And here's a few that we picked off the internet. Sort of repurposing utility dollars to fix stuff, save energy and water, and create jobs. Very similar to DOE's description. But I love this term repurposing, right? Because you're literally taking money you're spending anyway and repurposing it. And it's not like investing it in something you hope might make sense, right? Like taking on a personal basis, people invest money in the stock market all the time, hoping those stocks are going to increase in value, right? But you have no control over that. With this sort of an investment vehicle, you're taking money, you're giving away to, I think it's called Evergy now. It used to be KCP&L and other utilities in Missouri, and you're basically reinvesting it in facilities in a very controlled manner. So that's one of the best things about all of this that I really like. And because in virtually every state that we go to, it's legislatively empowered, right? And we'll talk about Missouri's legislation in a minute. And it's budget neutral, right? Which is really key because and virtually all public entities, it's a use it or lose it system, right? If you don't use that money in your budget that year, it may get cut from your budget the next year, right? This is a really bad problem with our US military clients who at the end of the fiscal year, the September, all kinds of money is being spent on things, not always in the wisest manner, but they're trying to keep their budgets intact for the following year. So this creates a budget neutral means of procurement that repays the original investment from the savings, which are guaranteed, as I mentioned before, to accrue from the project results. And this is, we'll talk about this some more later, is everything from converting your fluorescent fixtures in your office to LEDs. It's taking old chillers, boilers, windows, and replacing them, really doing infrastructure upgrades as well. And as Dale, who came up with this presentation, likes to say, it's a debt-free modernization of public facilities and system infrastructure by a single source provider. And it's either built to or in excess of your standards, right? And we'll talk about this some more later because it's energy savings performance contracting for a reason. It's not just energy savings contracting. These systems have got to perform, all right? And we'll talk about this again a little bit later in some more detail, but it's much different just from that one aspect than the design, bid, build standard in the US. There's some design build out there, but not nearly as much as there could be or should be. But a lot of design bid build projects that all of you, I'm sure, have been through them. You're often left at the end of the day holding the bag with your maintenance folks trying to fix brand new buildings or renovated buildings for the next 2 or 3 years. And we'll talk about that some more later and how this is different. So, and Dell likes to call this utopian perspective, and I understand where he's coming from, but done well and thought out and with the right technical assistance, this is really the single best vehicle I've ever seen, and I've been in this business since 1985, I've ever seen of public entities being able to improve their buildings and get what they were promised with recourse, right? Which we'll talk about that some more later on. So a little bit about your legislation. So I included a link here. This is a live link. So when you get copies of this, I'll PDF this when we send it, but it'll be a live link. You can click on this. And Missouri has some good, although sort of brief legislation. It was put in place almost 20 years ago now. Actually, August 28th, it'll be 20 years old. I can tell Energy Services Coalition probably had a hand in helping the legislators put this together because some of the language is similar to what we see in other states. And I'm not going to go through all of this. You can read this, separately. But a few of the things that are very interesting to me is that a lot of these things under the definitions of energy savings cost measures, energy cost savings measures, are typical what you expect: insulation, storm windows and doors, computer controls, HVAC or heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, so on. light fixtures, things like that you would expect to see in pretty much any energy upgrade project. A few of the things that I've colored here in yellow that I think are of particular interest, and some are incredibly timely. This F, indoor air quality improvements to increase air quality that conforms to the applicable state or local building code requirements, right? As we have all just lived through this horror show of the pandemic, look how important indoor air quality, or IAQ, has become, right? And it has really shown that in the US, unfortunately, HVAC has been way underfunded for generations, right? We put tons of money into IT and all the newest technologies and so on, and nice furniture and all that, but really lack the investment in HVAC. And this is a vehicle that you're allowed to address through this legislation, right? Cogeneration, which used to be really popular, not as popular as it used to be. And here's another one, I. Any life safety measures that provide long-term operating cost reductions and are in compliance with state and local codes, right? That's a big one. And I've actually worked on projects. I worked at a school district one time who had a horrible fire alarm system in their high school, and it kept going off, right? False alarms all the time. And it got to the point where the fire department started charging them like $100, $200, $500 every time they got a false alarm. As you can imagine, right? You're taking the firemen out of the house and onto the truck and down the road, and it's wasting a lot of time, effort, and potentially lives. So we were able to actually help them get a measure included as part of a controls upgrade to replace the whole fire life safety system, right? So the fact that you can do this in Missouri is that's pretty powerful. Another one here, which again, I've never seen this in any other legislation, is compliance with ADA, or the Americans with Disability Act. So that if you can do something that will actually create some long-term operating costs, I see this sometimes in renovations of bathrooms and other things, you can include them in a project like this, right? So that's just some high-level issues about that. And I get a bunch of definitions here of different things in the legislation. One of the ones I just wanted to point out was operational savings, right? Expenses are eliminated, are applicable to this. So if you end up replacing, 10 or 15 rooftop units on a warehouse, say, and used to outsource the maintenance of those to a third-party firm, you can now cancel that contract because you don't have to have that maintained externally anymore, right? In most cases, you can either do it yourself, or you can renegotiate that contract with the company to cut it from, $10,000 a year to $2,000 a year, just as an example. Now, a few of the things that I found were missing from this that I see in some other ones that were done later is water and sewer. But because they can be considered operating cost savings, you can usually include water and sewer. It's just not spelled out in the legislation. Neither is renewable energy. And if you think about it, 20 years ago, really nobody was doing solar, right? It was way, way too expensive. Nor wind, right? Wind was even more off the charts expensive. But now we know that they're a big deal. And solar has gone down in cost by 75% in 8 years, right? And battery storage is following the same path, right? Which is really great for everybody, especially in a place like Missouri, which gets tornadoes and flooding and all of this. Really being able to improve resilience using solar and battery storage is going to be a huge bonus in that state. The last slide about the legislation here is one of the things that are included is the description of the qualified providers. That's basically the energy services companies. We'll talk about that some more later on, which can be pre-qualified by a state. You can create a pool of pre-qualified contractors that any public entity in the state can choose from. One of the things that's important about this is that you can negotiate a contract and award a contract to a qualified provider, and the repayment of those funds over time, we'll explain how that all works later on, needs to be completed within a 15-year period from the date the installation is complete. So what that gives you is a 15-year planning horizon, right? Which is great, and most cases people are looking for like, oh, I need to have a 3-year payback, 5-year payback, right? and so on. Here you're getting a 15-year repayment period. So that really allows you to stuff these projects full with as many infrastructure renewal type projects as can pencil in one of these deals. And we'll talk about that some more later on. But this is really is a great opportunity. And some states we've seen lately are going to 20 and even 25 years, like the federal government does. The federal government allows for a 25-year term, which allows you to do some really, really deep retrofits on these projects. This next one I wanted to point out, it's important to note that the energy and operational cost savings, or both together, will meet or exceed the costs of the energy cost savings measures, adjusted for inflation within 15 years. So what that's saying is that you're going to say you hire a company and they're going to do a $10 million project. And just to make the math simple, they're going to save you $1 million a year, right? Which is a 10-year simple payback. And to throw on some money for oversight, financing costs, operations and maintenance, so on over time, you're going to finance it over 12 or 13 years. You're allowed to do it up to 15. So what that's saying is that every year of the contract term, the payment has got to be less than the savings, right? So by statute. So you can't have a deal where the ESCO is guaranteeing you $800,000 one year and $1.2 million the next year, right? Averaging $1 million. That's not how it works. So every year there's this guaranteed minimum cost savings, right? Which is a wonderful thing. And that's what allows this to be incredibly attractive to financiers, because they know that they're going to get paid, right? There's also, these get basically equated to paying the electric bill, if you will, and we'll talk about that some more later on. And they know that all public entities pay their bills, so they're certainly going to pay back these loans. And especially in states and in local governments that have really good credit ratings, there's billions and billions of dollars of money waiting to invest in these kinds of deals. And even with rates going up now, it's an even better time to invest in deals like this. So anyway, I could go on and on about this, but like I said, I think it's good legislative language. I already mentioned the water, sewer, and renewable energy are missing. It'd be nice to get those added one of these days. Another thing that is out there about ESPC, the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy, or ACEEE, does ratings, sort of like the college rankings that you see by US News and World Report every year. ACEEE does this for states and how they treat efficiency, right? And Missouri is usually in the middle to the upper tier of the pack. And it's based mostly on energy efficiency programs that are funded and managed by utilities. Performance contracting used to be included in it. It's not currently, and they're working on getting it included again. But as part of the report that they put out every year, and this is a link to this that's in blue, and I just copied and pasted it here. It basically just talks about what Missouri has been doing, and it shows that Division of Facilities has really been putting in a fair amount of performance contracting. Over 3,500 buildings have been retrofitted using PC since 2005, and an investment over $100 million in 14.7 million square feet has been done. So it shows you, I mean, it's a relatively active market there, but I'm sure there's even more that can be done. So for those of you who haven't even heard about this before, it's a known quantity in Missouri, and it's not like you'd be out there on the bleeding edge of anything. So hopefully that's sort of at a high level what performance contracting is, right? If there's any other questions, we've gone through a little more description here. So it's a means of finance that provides a means to repay the upfront financial commitment. So what you're basically doing is taking what you would normally ask for capital for, which could take you 3 to 5 years to get the capital, right? And then I hear this from all of the state clients I've had over the years, and allows you to take that need and amortize it over time. So it's much like getting a mortgage on a house versus coming up with $500,000 to buy the house outright. You do a 20, 30-year mortgage on it, and you pay it back over time. Right? It's similar perspective. and also allows you to leverage grants and incentives. So those of you who've done any sort of energy efficiency project in the past know that you can go to your local utility, gas and electric utilities primarily, and get incentives from them. However many dollars per light for an LED or a new variable frequency drive or whatever you're doing. And if you're doing a project, here and there, you don't really get a lot of incentives back, right? It's very prescriptive. By doing a performance contract, it allows you, and again, it depends on the utility, to take advantage of what they call custom incentives or bonus incentives, where if you do a comprehensive project, the utility will usually give you a bonus of anywhere from 10 or 20% more to 50% more money, cash on the barrelhead, right, to implement these projects. Now, with these incentives, they're awesome to use, but they get paid in arrears. So you have to have completed the project to actually get the money, right? Which makes sense. Sort of like a mail-in rebate for something that you buy. So what that means sometimes is you have to borrow all of the money, right? Say that $10 million project, and you're going to get, $500,000 in incentives. You have to borrow that 10 million, and you're going to end up getting back $500,000. Right. So sometimes ESCOs might be willing to guarantee those utility incentives, but it's very rare because these change from time to time, as those of you who've been involved in this program know. So what it doesn't provide is the upfront financing directly, right? That's a separate instrument, which we'll talk about. So the ESPC is basically the contract between the owner and the energy services company, or the ESCO. It's also a means of competitive procurement in that you can actually, pick ESCOs mainly on qualifications, right? And I'm sure all of them, or not all of them, all of you have been approached by an ESCO or multiple ESCOs in the past, 3, 5, 10 years. A lot of them would love for you to just hire them, right? But that's very difficult to do in a public environment. So you want to have a good competitive procurement done. And you can base it mainly on qualifications, but you can also include what we call indicative pricing, without having them go out and do a free audit, come up with actual costs and savings for, chillers, boilers, lighting, whatever. That I think is a big waste of time and money. You can have them give you indicative ideas of what's their overhead and profit, right? What are your markups on subcontractors? What are your engineering fees? Is it 1%, 3%, 5%? Commissioning fees, training fees, measurement and verification fees, right? And there's spreadsheets out there that you can use to do all this, but allows you to do a qualifications heavy solicitation with indicative pricing, right? Because this isn't a bid situation. Typically when you hire an ESCO, you're not buying the project, right? You're buying, or not selecting a project, you're selecting a partner, right? We'll talk about that some more later on. But this gives you a way to do an apples to apples comparison when you are doing a solicitation. So it works in that it allows you to competitively procure the service provider. It also allows you to competitively procure the contract. And it's done in a single source. So as we like to say, one neck to choke, right? So instead of you going and hiring, say, a local engineering firm to do energy audits on all your buildings, and you pay for that cash, right? Because the engineering firms don't take risks and things like that. They have to be paid for their services. And then you hire either that same firm or another firm to design everything and put it out to bid. So you've done another procurement. You may have hired an independent commissioning agent, independent cost estimator, right? You may have hired multiple engineers. You may need a structural review for solar, an architect for historic registered buildings, and so on and so forth. So you may go through 5 or 6 different procurements. With this, you can do a single source procurement. Other than perhaps hiring an owner's rep to help you through the process, we'll talk about that some more later on. And this single source provider does the auditing, the studies upfront, the due diligence, the follow-up design. Once you've picked out what measures you want to implement, they do the implementation. Most of them act more or less like a general contractor, highly specialized GC that hires a local mechanical, electrical, and other specialty contractors, and performance, right? So there's none of this, who shot John finger pointing kind of thing that you would see in normal design but build construction, where your electrical contractor is claiming the GC made a mistake, the GC is claiming the architect made a mistake on the plans. And there's all this fighting, and you as the public entity and the owner really get left holding the bag, right, at the end of the day. And that's no fun. And I've been brought in to try to unwind deals like that. And it's not a lot of fun over time. One of the things that's important about this, though, is everybody on this phone call is used to standard bidding and public procurement. What ends up happening, even though you may competitively procure the single entity, the single company, without having actually spec'd a project yet, most of their subcontractor costs are going to be competitively bid, right? And that's not necessarily included in your legislation. So it gives you some latitude to be able to work with the ESCO to basically demand bidding on most of the bigger ticket items, which most of them are going to do anyway. And you can also get transparency into all of that pricing, which we'll talk about some more later on, so that you really see what's getting put into the cost buildup, right? We like to call it open book pricing. So what's in a name, right? Although what we're calling this ESPC, there's all kinds of names out there. Some have come and gone, some are still around. I'm not going to read all these off to you, but they come in all different flavors, but all basically boil down to the same thing. That's what we're talking about, right? It's a turnkey. I like to talk about it as a turnkey, very sophisticated design build with performance metrics, right? Because there's a lot of design build being done in the US today to build, water treatment plants, courthouses, so on and so forth. But still, at the end of that 1-year warranty period, the owner is left with virtually zero recourse, unless there's, major negligence in a design where you can actually sue and get some sort of recompense for it. There's very little you can do if, like, the air conditioning isn't working properly. And the most common one is the controls were never finished, right? That's the last thing to get done in a building. Everyone has run out of money and the contractor's off to the next moneymaker, right? And you become history in their books. And with this, the ESCO, the contractor, has got 15 years of skin in the game. So it's a much different process, and we'll talk about that some more. So for these new solutions, here's some public sector considerations. So what statutes define the transaction, right? And there's some states who have a really, really detailed enabling legislation. In some cases, much too detailed. It was written poorly, and it's very, very specific, and it gives the agencies and the entities very little latitude to veer from that, right? Other states have got really wide open legislation that you can drive a bus through, right? And it doesn't really give the state agencies and local governments a lot to hang their hat on, especially if there hasn't been a lot of policy guidance written to reinforce that legislation, right? So it's good if you're going to do one of these, talk to the energy office here, get some assistance on making sure you're meeting the statutes. And if there's any other policy guidance, make sure you're meeting that as well. And then you can always enlist outside help. We're going to talk a little bit later about owners reps who can help you basically wade through some of this. And what means of public procurement is required, right? And so it gets spelled out in the statute here that I pointed out that you have the link for. And of course, how it's done in practice is always a little bit different than what it states in the legislation, because that doesn't really cover the details of procurement. But what we see in most cases, public procurement officials are using that statute as sort of the foundation of putting procurement documents together. The nice thing is, we'll talk about later on, Energy Services Coalition has compiled a whole set of documents that's free for any public entity out there to use. So you don't have to invent any of this, right? Usually you're going to take those documents, and then we have a link at the end of the presentation. You can take those documents and customize them for your state or your agency within the state, like a lot of corrections agencies within states basically update them and change them for security requirements and so on and so forth. So that's what typically gets done. And some quasi-governmental entities, sometimes like public water and wastewater authorities, have slightly different procurement requirements. They can modify those standard documents as well. So some of the things to think about through this is who owns the improvements, right? Well, just like when you buy your house and put a mortgage on it, right? We all know who actually owns the house, right? In name, it's yours, but the bank really owns it until that is paid off, right? It's similar to this, but in public procurement, of course, the public agency owns that asset, right? You just are going to have the bank or the financier is going to have a security on it, a security interest in it, or a lien on it, right? That's typically what happens. That's the most common thing. And there's other ways of doing this where the ownership transfers over. You may have heard of public-private partnerships, P3. It's primarily been done in the US so far for toll roads and sometimes dormitories and so on. But it's slowly getting into energy. Some of you may have heard of the Ohio State University deal where they basically turned over all of those assets to a third party. So in that case, they actually really own the assets, but for performance contracting, the public entity still owns the asset. So who holds the risk of performance? Well, that we could spend an hour just on that, right? But basically, an energy savings performance contract done right shifts 90% of the performance risk to the ESCO. That's when you have really well-written contract documents. You have a very detailed, comprehensive, and an open book investment grade audit done, which we're going to talk about that in the next few slides. And you've had some good oversight done, either internally or with external help to do oversight of this energy services company as they develop the project, install the project, and then maintain the project over time. So if you think about it from simple terms, the ESCO is going to have the risk of they put in a brand new chiller, right? And that's got to run, right? It has to actually operate and produce the chilled water at 44 degrees, so on and so forth. But most of the risk of the operation and maintenance of these systems, of course, still lay with the owner, right? Unless you, through the contract documents, have agreed to turn over, say, maintenance of a brand new central chiller plant, which happens a lot to your local equipment provider. The risk of, changing filters, lubing motors, tightening belts, all of that stuff, that usually still falls on the owner. So as part of these deals, and we'll talk about this some more later on, training is a very important component, right? There's a whole schedule in the contract about training, a training plan, which again, you never see in public procurement. And one of the reasons I like this is I come from a family of laborers who are all carpenters, painters, HVAC techs, steam fitters, and so on. And it's good to see that you actually get the training, especially today as buildings become more and more sophisticated. That is absolutely key. So by not doing those things, can you put the guarantee in jeopardy? Surely. But that is a rarity, especially if you've had folks on your team, and we'll talk about that some more later, who've been involved from the beginning and really buy off on the project, just like any project you're doing, whether it's an IT system-wide upgrade, you need everybody to buy into this. And it really helps make for a successful project. And what can the provider do that puts the guarantee in jeopardy? Well, not designing, installing, and commissioning the equipment properly are the three biggest things that we see. But like I said, with the proper technical oversight and monitoring, that rarely happens, right? For virtually every project we've ever worked on has worked really, really well for the owners. Another thing is the upfront financing debt, right? It used to not be considered debt. And again, I'm an engineer, I'm not a finance guy, but with all the changes in laws recently and policies recently, it seems like anything that you do that creates any sort of financial obligation on the part of a public entity is being considered debt, right? And that's, GASB, FASB rules, but There's other people who can explain that to you in some more detail. And is a non-appropriation clause included, right? So this is key to the success of these projects. And we've included an internet definition here, which we won't go into, but what it basically says is that if for some reason your state legislature or your city government doesn't appropriate the money for your payment, that, like I used that example earlier, the $10 million project, $1 million a year in savings, your payment's going to be roughly $1 million a year in repayment over that 12 or 13 years. Because the financier knows this non-appropriation clause is in here, they're taking that risk, right? But they know that the risk of a public entity not paying back a loan is very, very small, right? So it allows public entities to use this vehicle while protecting themselves at the same time. So, look what happened during the pandemic, right? In some states, the budgets really got slaughtered. In other states, it wasn't so bad, right? So who knows what can happen. So whose process should I follow, right? You want to follow the process laid out in the statutes and any other policy guidance that's backing that up. Another consideration is whose contract should I use? Well, we recommend never ever using the ESCO's contract, right? As I mentioned earlier, if the state, Missouri doesn't have standard contracts, then the Energy Services Coalition can provide them for free, right? No charge, and then you can take them and modify them as needed. And as you can imagine, much like anything else, it's like reading an insurance policy, right? They tend to be a bit opaque and one-sided if you take an energy service company's contract. So we highly recommend you go get a third-party contract. And these ones that Energy Services Coalition put together, they assembled from other states, right? They didn't write these. And we'll talk about that some more later on. It's already been vetted by ESCO legal and state agency legal. So it's really a very positive document. So there are a lot of things like this here are going to be similar to what you see in other construction projects for termination, what's required, what's the penalty, what's the means of termination. These are very similar to construction. If something does not go well during construction, you have your standard termination for cause, termination for convenience, so on and so forth. And you want to review a copy of the contract. Who can do a legal review, right? So you definitely want to have your in-house counsel review these contracts because they're pretty complex, right? It's like a construction contract with a bit more performance associated with it. So it's a bit different in your standard, AIA construction document. Same thing with procurement review, right? You want to make sure that your procurement people are intimately involved in this the whole way through. A lot of our clients send this out to outside counsel if they haven't done one of these before, just to get another set of eyes on it with a firm who actually has experience with performance contracting, right? Because there's a lot of financial advisors and a lot of attorneys out there who've never done this, right? They'll tell you they have and they haven't really. So you want to do your homework if you're going to do that. And a lot of states around Missouri have been doing this for years. Kansas has been doing this for years, right? Texas has been doing this for years, right? Arkansas, many, many other states have been doing this, Illinois, and so on. So is the upfront financing debt, as I mentioned in the last slide, these days, yes. Because it's an offsetting reduction in planned costs, it's treated differently in many cases than, we're going to build a new building and we're going to incur a lot of debt for it, right? Because there's no real payback to that. With this, you're actually reducing costs on a dollar for dollar basis equal to your repayment. So it's viewed much differently by the rating agencies, Fitch and Moody's and all that. And another thing on that, it isn't actually a bullet in this slide, but what's come out in the past few years, I've learned at some of these conferences I've gone to around this stuff, is that these rating agencies are now taking sustainability into consideration. So when they're looking to give, a state or a city, a AAA rating, they're now asking, what are you doing about sustainability or ESG, right? Environment, sustainability and governance. And that's becoming a big deal. So these projects are helping you address that issue, right? So it's very, very helpful from that point of view. And the last one here, can we still use my construction contract, right? You're the one that you're used to using, and yes, right? Because that contains all of the requirements, rules, regulations, everything that you have to basically keep your contractors on the straight and narrow. And usually these are put in to a schedule in the ESPC agreement or the energy services agreement. And there's almost always some modifications that are needed, but then it doesn't require you to have to, reinvent the wheel here. Speaking of wheel, we're going to switch gears a little bit here, right? I can see, Sam, do we have a question? It looks like there's one question so far.
I don't see any questions here on my end.
Okay, I just see number one under chat. So okay, well I will keep going. So why ESPC, right? Typically, this is done, and it's been getting done, like I said, for 40 years because public entities just don't have a lot of extra money laying around, right? That tends to be the case, right? And that has gotten even worse over the past 12 years since the economic meltdown in 2008, right? It's never really come back. And it probably never will, right? The capital appropriations just aren't there. So this is becoming a bigger and bigger opportunity for folks in state and local government agencies. And these days, there's a lot of energy goals out there. And of course, this varies from state to state, city to city. Some cities have very, very progressive goals. And maybe you're looking at a, 40% reduction in energy use by 2030, something like that, right? These can, in a one fell swoop, meet all of these goals, right? In many cases. We have some cities we've worked with that are doing one comprehensive program like this. They've cut their use by 30% on average across their building stock, which has really reduced their energy use. It'll help you meet environmental targets, reducing everything from NOx and SOx to greenhouse gas emissions to reducing the amount of power used, which means the amount of coal, right? Because coal is, I think, the largest contributor to power production in Missouri. That really reduces the amount of emissions from coal plants, which really helps, cleaner air, less asthma, so on and so forth. And then local job creation, like I said, the amount of jobs created over the years in this is in the tens of thousands, right? Which is really, really helpful, especially at times where sort of blue collar employment is down. This is hiring tons of HVAC mechanics, electricians, carpenters, painters, like I said, steam fitters, all these kinds of folks who, when the economy is slowed down, this can give you a great avenue. And the failing facility and system infrastructure, right? There's just no shortage of that, right? The deferred maintenance backlog in every state that I've ever been to, and I've worked in 37 of the states so far, and several foreign countries. It's pretty abysmal, right? It's pretty abysmal, and this can really help you attack that. And then the need for resilience, right? This is becoming, unfortunately, every year more and more prevalent, and that we really need to make our buildings more resilient, right? Allow them to stay up and running, especially critical buildings, schools, firehouses, hospitals, gas stations, right? And others, keep them up and running during storms, floods, whatever it is that might be happening, hurricanes, and so on and so forth. And it gives you a really incredible leveraging tool. We'll talk about this some more later on, where, I talked about these chiller plant replacements. It's a great example because a lot of times, you may have had a bunch of buildings built in the 90s or early 2000s, and now those chiller plants are 20 to 25 years old. They need to be replaced, right? And typically that's $1 million, $2 million, $5 million to replace a central chiller plant. And you may only be able to get $500,000 in appropriations to do it. And you can't do that with a chiller plant, for example. You need to replace like the chillers, the pumps, the motors, everything kind of all at once. It's very hard to do it on a piecemeal basis. One of these deals, you can take that $500,000, put it into the deal, almost like a down payment, like I said, on buying a house. So that's $500,000 less you have to borrow, and you get all of the savings associated with it. So say it's going to be $2 million to build the plant. $500,000 is from appropriations. The other $1.5 million is from the savings, right? From that capital that those savings are creating, right, for you. So if you think about it, it really is an immense leveraging tool for you to get a lot done in a short period of time, right? I had a client once at a big Army base in upstate New York, where the 10th Mountain Division is based. And he'd spent 20 years trying to upgrade his control systems on that base. And of course, it was like a bridge painting exercise. He'd finally get through a good chunk of the base, and those controls are now obsolete. He had to start over. And he did a $6 million controls project, replaced all the controls on the whole base, right? Stuff he'd been trying to get done for 20 years. So there's really incredible value in that, as well as including the incentives that I'd mentioned before from utilities and these federal grants that are coming down the road that I'll talk about later on. So
Hey, Chris,
there's a
we do have
standard.
a question here.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
And this is a question about reduction goals. So with reduction goals and dollars saved, are contracts written to include future prices of energy, or are they just kind of traditionally written in the basic, dollars per kilowatt hour?
Yes. So that is there's a lot around that one topic. It's a fantastic question, right? Because that's when there's issues around these kinds of projects, they're around two things. Why am my electric bills, my energy bills not going down the way you promised, right? Because they're just looking at the bills. And that's mainly because the price of energy continues to go up, right? And we're in a particularly bad time now with the war in Ukraine and all of that. That's caused natural gas prices to skyrocket, right? And diesel and everything else. And utilities are investing a tremendous amount of money into the grid, right? Because of, like I said, the storms and the floods and all of that. So there's billions of dollars being put into the grid and all the money to incorporate wind and solar, especially where you guys are in the Midwest and the Great Plains. I mean, they're completely restructuring the transmission grid to bring in all of this, huge wind power investment that's being put in. So when these deals are written, the savings, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on when we get to the investment grade audit, the due diligence study that's done as part of these deals are called an investment grade audit. Part of that investment grade audit is the baseline. Part of that baseline is how much am I spending now, right? And absolute dollars, say it's $10 million a year you're spending, but how much am I paying to my local electric utility? Well, it's however many cents per kilowatt hour now, right? So the savings in the deal are calculated based on savings now or a year from now when the project is completed, and it gets escalated by 1 year. What's included in all of these deals is a built-in escalator, right? Everyone agrees to, all right, we're going to call it 2% per year, say, right? And that's a very common one. So that everyone knows, eyes wide open going into this deal, that the value of those savings are going to be escalated by 2% per year for the 12, 13 to 15 years of the deal. So that really makes a huge difference, because then and we'll talk about this some more later on, when the ESCO is doing their cash flow pro forma, they'll show you, here's the capital cost, right? Here is the repayment cost, right? We've taken the capital cost, added everything in. We've split it up over the 15 years, just like any loan that you do, new car, new house, whatever it is. And then here's your payment, right? And much like you can do on any other loan, these tend to be slightly backloaded because they know, the financiers know that the value of those energy savings are going up every year, that everyone has agreed to at the beginning, right? And we'll talk about measurement and verification later on, which is putting the certainty behind that assumption and that agreement. And so you end up with a slightly increased slope, if you will, if you can visualize this, of your savings value going up every year. And then your payment goes up slightly every year, right? So that allows you to pack a lot into this deal, because if you can amortize something that's going to be worth $800,000 in the first year, but $1.2 million in the last year, that allows you to include a lot of investment over that time period. So that was the one thing, right? That's how it works for agreeing to escalation rates every year. And we'll talk about later on some more of the detail. Now, what again was the second half of that question? Oh, reduction goals. Yes. So reduction goals, they're not often included in these contracts, right? The savings that the ESCO is guaranteeing is in fact in kilowatt hours, right? In CCF of gas, in gallons of water, with the associated tariff value, or what we're calling the commodity value, right? So they're guaranteeing you 50 million kilowatt hours, right? I'm making that number up, 50 million kilowatt hours per year, because that's not going to vary, right? That's the guaranteed minimum. That may be above that, right? But that is the minimum they're guaranteeing you. The value of that may go up and down over time in reality, but the actual contracted savings are the ones that I talked about there, where they're attaching a known value every year of the contract year. So that's the beautiful thing about these cash flows, which I don't have one to show you in this presentation, and we can provide one afterwards if you like, but it shows you very simply what the economics look like for these deals, right? So did that answer the question?
Yes.
It did. Okay, great. Awesome. So I will continue on here. So the standing presumption is, if you have all the money, all the time, and ample expertise, simply do the work yourself, right? Of course, right? Why wouldn't you, right? If I could build my own house, I would, but I don't have the money. I don't have the time. I certainly don't have the expertise. As you all know, engineers are great at theory, but you don't want me doing your plumbing for you, right? So this is why this is such a great vehicle. One of the reasons why is because you can get the money, you can get the expertise, you can hire on consultants, you can hire on contractors that have the time to do this, but you get to oversee it and make sure everything gets done the way you want it done, right? Some of the earliest principles when this really started off, like I said, in the 80s, and a bunch of stuff needs to be replaced, repaired. You don't have the money, time, or expertise to do it. Meets up with, like I said, there's vendors out there selling you all kinds of things, right? New kinds of additives to refrigerant, new kinds of light fixtures, all this kind of stuff. You put that together into a package that's got a lot of rules and regulations around it. You can really make hay with this, right? And done properly, like I said, this is the best way I've seen it done. Now, shared savings was the original way of doing this, right? Where the ESCO buys all the stuff, installs it, you pay them back over time when the savings occur, all right? But what ended up happening was, like back when I first started in this business, right, there were no computers in offices, right? There were no fax machines. It was basically just people sitting in offices. And then you started adding computers, you started adding all these other things. And next thing you know, these deals weren't really working out well, right? And you had all these financial things that had gone on. So that model kind of expired. It was great in that there were no loans, no liens, no debt, no risk, really, but there were terribly opaque contracts, right? They weren't really good for the owner at the end of the day. So the later solution was, well, let's hire a company to develop, install, and monitor the savings of these projects, but we'll borrow the money, right? We'll be the ones in charge of doing that, because that's what we do all the time as a state, right? A local government. You float bonds all the time, right? You lease fire trucks all the time, right? You do all these kinds of things, copy machines, water systems, all kinds of stuff. Gets either bonded or leased on a daily basis. So this is nothing new for any public entity. So they said, let's take care of this part of it, and we'll let the technical folks manage the technical part of it. The most common financing tool in this business is the tax-exempt lease purchase model, right? And I'm not going to get into the details of it, but you can see by the name, because it's tax-exempt, you get pretty good rates, right? Up until recently, before the rates started going up a few months ago, many of our clients were getting 2 to 2.5%, right? And those are higher now. But that was basically the same as the cost of living increase, right? So it's basically free money for all intents and purposes. And as I'd said before, there's always a security interest or lien on it, usually, depending on how the financing contract is written. But the big difference here is that the proof of the savings, right? The teeth of the guarantee is moved to measurement and verification, right? And I have included a link in here for those of you who are sort of geeks about this or are much more interested in this. This efficiency valuation organization is a international nonprofit that was set up to create protocols around measurement and verification of savings, right? Of energy savings. And this gets used throughout the US in both the energy efficiency market as well as the utility savings market, right? Like all of these utility energy savings programs, I'm sure you hear about, all use IPMVP as the protocol, sort of as a gospel, if you will. And so that allows folks like us who are experts in this to work with you and be sort of the people talking gospel with the ESCOs, right? Because you folks don't have the time to learn all of these details, right? You're busy in your day-to-day job. And these are put in place to help you, much like you have in architecture, right? And other professions, there's protocols around how you do certain things. And this is basically taken what had been a really ad hoc, haphazard, and honestly not very transparent part of the business and turned it into something that you can literally bank on, right? Because literally these banks are looking at these M&V plans, sometimes hire firms to look at the M&V plans from these deals and say, do these hold water or not? And if they do, they agree to loan the money, right? Like I used to do this for Bank of America, and we would look at these big deals and they go, yep, it looks like the ESCO did their homework and this looks like it's going to work for the owner, right? And so they felt happy writing, a $60 million check. One of the things you have to be careful of is some less scrupulous contractors will be like, well, there's really no point in M&V because we're guaranteeing the savings, right? It says it right there in our contract. But things always change, right? And as we just learned, right, going through the pandemic, my goodness, how working in an office has changed, and will always be different now as a result of that. Things are constantly changing. So you want something that's science-based that you can then follow up with over time. And the very science of M&V resolves this challenge, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So this has really evolved over time. Some of the newer wrinkles, right, in this Dodd-Frank Act basically said, you know what, after this whole thing of shenanigans that went on in 2005, 6, 7, 8, where you had double dealing going on between accounting firms and their consulting arms and all that, we're only letting licensed professional financial advisors give financial advice, right? So unless you are a registered financial advisor, which includes ESCOs, which includes folks like me, we cannot give financial advice to public entities, right? You need to seek a registered municipal advisor, an FA or an MA. So it's really, helped clarify how this gets done. And so a third-party financier is being used, and it's a continued evolution towards a least costly rate, right? And these lowest rates tend to be securitized transactions. And this is a bit of a cottage industry. So there's some specialty lenders out there that know that, yes, I'm lending you all this money to put in new lights and boilers in your school. Are they really going to come and rip out the lights and boilers? No, they're not really going to do that. But knowing they have the security in that and the good credit and good faith of the public entity, they're going to be lending the money at a reasonable rate, right? So this is still continues to be the best way of doing this that we've seen, are the most commonly used way of doing this, using TELP financing or other forms of third-party financing. So there's some newer things that have come out. And you saw that crazy slide earlier with all those different names. A few of them that were on there were energy as a service or efficiency as a service, or EAAS. We're starting to see this become more and more commonplace, especially in industry, where a lot of big companies that have got manufacturing plants and office buildings all over the place, they don't want to really be spending their capital on this kind of stuff. They'd rather spending it on designing new products and hiring new salespeople and so on. So they've been starting to veer towards this energy as a service. So it's similar to performance contracting, but it is not performance contracting. And it gets a little confusing because some of the same ESCOs do both, right? So their performance contracting is really aimed at the public market. EAAS is really more aimed at the private market, even though there's some of it going on in the public market, right? The biggest difference is that the developer or the contractor provides the financing. They own the asset, right? So they literally take ownership of that asset. They're responsible for all the operations and maintenance. And at the end, there's an asset transfer back to you. Much like you see a lot of entities have done, like build lease back buildings, where they build a building, they lease it for 10 years, whatever, then they lease it back for like, $1, something at the end of the thing. So that's similar to what happens with EAAS. It's a pretty cool model, but again, it's like performance contracting was 20 years ago, not a lot of transparency and so on. And I put a little thing in plain English here at the bottom. In other words, it's like you buy the light or the heat, not the light fixture or the furnace on a monthly subscription basis. Kind of similar to something almost everybody's familiar with now is solar PPAs, where you're not actually buying those solar panels on your roof, right? You don't own them at all. You don't even own the green aspects of it. All you're doing is paying a little bit less on your electric bill to that third-party provider. So some other principles associated with ESPC is that these are partnership opportunity where the institution and the ESCO are working together. And it's much more collaborative, right? Again, I was in design bid build for years before I got involved in this. I worked for an ESCO in the 90s and did work all over the country. And really, it was so refreshing because we literally got to sit on the same side of the table with the owner and kind of co-author the solution here, all right? Because we didn't have to worry about low bidding. Like your central plant is already all trained, and then they put an extension on it, it comes in all carrier, right? And that doesn't really work. And controls, it was even worse. 7 different kinds of controls across one campus, right? It's just craziness. So this allows you to really work together and get the stuff that you want. Like you may have your maintenance folks are all trained on a certain type of equipment. You can get that included in one of these deals, which is great. And because the ESCO has got the skin in the game, like I said before, for 15 years, it is in their best interest to make this work for you, right? Because the last thing they want are callbacks, because you can give them callbacks through one of these deals, unlike a normal design bid build project. All the work's going to be required to meet or exceed the standards of the institution, right? There's none of this saving energy to reduce your mission, right? Mission comes first, whether it's teaching children, healing the sick, corrections, whatever it is, that always comes first. Energy savings is a nice byproduct. And everything's got to work as far as indoor air quality and so on. Operating conditions known as standards of comfort, like temperature, humidity, lighting levels, and all that cannot be sacrificed for efficiency. And you'll see later on, there's a whole schedule in the contract that has it written out in plain English. What are your occupied and unoccupied temperature, humidity, and so on? Your light levels have to meet the Illuminating Engineering Society of North America's, or IESNA's, requirements, right? And that's typically in every state's books. And if not, you get it included in your contract so that they can't start, delamping on you to reduce the light levels and saving energy, but making it, dark in the hallways, right? That's not going to work. And the savings achieved must pay for all obligations and costs each and every year, right? So there's no passing excess savings from one year to the next year, or paying for a shortfall because you may have had a hot summer, cold summer, whatever. That all gets calculated out. We'll talk about that later on. I like to say there's no rollover minutes in ESPC, right? Just because they saved you more money one year, it's wonderful. That's a little extra money you didn't have to spend with your utility this year, but it doesn't get redistributed. So something else that's really become important now, right? appropriated funds, again, like I mentioned earlier, right, that getting your $500,000 for the chiller plant to pay for the $2 million one with the savings is great. If you have any appropriated funds and you're allowed to do it, please feel free to throw them in there. But now, as I'm sure you've all heard by now, this bipartisan infrastructure law, and this is a link to take you to it with much more detail. I'm only going to spend a minute or two on this. But the two most important ones here is this bill has set aside $550 million through this Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grant, which is quite a mouthful, EECBG program. The purpose of this is to assist eligible local governments, states, and territories and Indian tribes in implementing strategies to reduce energy use, fossil fuel use, and so on. All right. So every state is getting an allocation on a formulaic basis, and then there's going to be some competition for a certain portion of that. And then I think I may be wrong on this, you can go to that link to get the details. I think the top 10 cities in each state are getting an automatic award. And if any of you were around with the ARA funding 10, 12 years ago, it's very similar in how the money's going to be dispensed that way. If you're a K through 12 school, and then some like nonprofits schools, I think potentially charter schools, something like that, but I'm not sure the details. There's a separate program, $500 million in grants for energy efficiency and renewable energy improvements of public schools. And these are going to be awarded on a competitive basis with the use of performance contracting as one of the prioritization factors. So this is something to look into, right? Because, and I know some of our folks that I work with currently are really looking hard at this and seeing how can they program this money into their projects they want to do over the next few years. And it's 4-year money, right? Some of these are 4-year money. So it can be really, really helpful. So some other important considerations: refer to the enabling legislation for your state, ensure it's followed, right? I just clipped a little bit out of your legislation here as a repeat of what I had earlier. And the language within the proposal, the IGA, the performance contract, all the schedules and everything cannot supersede or conflict with your enabling statute, right? So that comes first. And it's in here twice for a reason, right? Because I've seen this happen before where the contract gets signed or gets put in front of somebody and they ask us to review it and we're like, ooh, well, this isn't really meeting statute. You shouldn't be doing this, right? So this is one of the most important parts of all of this, right? Like they say, it takes a village to get something done. Assembling an ESPC team is probably the single biggest key to success with one of these projects, right? Because it is something new and different for a lot of people. One of the first things you want to do is identify sort of who are your energy folk. Typically, that's going to be like your internal champion or ringleader, and maybe a head of public works, and maybe a head of your chief sustainability officer, energy manager, whatever. And they're typically required to help assemble needed resources, tools, and the expertise for this. Somebody who actually understands what a kilowatt hour is, right? Somebody who has already existing relationships with facilities, maintenance, procurement, sometimes design and construction, sometimes finance and budget because they're dealing with increasing or decreasing energy bills. So they tend to be sort of the conductor of the orchestra here in many cases, right? You also want to make sure you have legal involved, right? And I mentioned earlier about hiring an owner's rep, and we'll talk about this in the next few slides, includes that. But as you're just thinking about doing a performance contract, that's the time to hire a third party because they can help you put all of this together, help you get the right language together and all of the documentation and the flow charts and all of that, any experience of getting your team educated to this concept before you even think about putting any sort of procurement out on the street, right? You want to make sure your team understands this, right? They won't all understand it at the exact same level, but we get everybody to within a certain bandwidth of understanding of performance contracting so that the rest of the program is smooth sailing. So it's the same for legal, right? If you're going to consider one of these, you talk to your in-house counsel at the very beginning. Hey, statute allows us to do this. We never get enough money to do what we need done. We have these failing buildings, right? We need to invest a lot of money in indoor air quality. We have all this post-COVID stuff, you get their input on it, right? And get them up to speed on what you're looking to do. And I have found that is the single best way to make sure these things are successful. I've had a couple of clients over the years who waited. They spent all this time, 9 months to a year, then told their attorneys, and attorneys were like, oh, you can't do this, it's illegal. And stop the whole thing for 6 months till they convince them that it's not in fact illegal and that it's something that is actually very positive. So, and once you have your legal folks on board, they can help you customize documents, review all of the stuff that comes in from the ESCO to ensure it meets all of your requirements and you avoid any contradictions or miss things that are missing as well. Same with finance, right? Because this is primarily a financial instrument to deliver technical improvements. The finance people are probably the single most important part of all of this, right? Because without their buy-in, it's not happening, right? I mean, that's just the plain and simple of it. And they know how the money moves within your organizations, right? It's still a bit of a black art to me, right? How this money gets moved from one line item to another inside, especially complicated state budgets or very big municipal budgets. They know how to move that money around. So if you're going to take money out of, and this is what happens most of the time, back to this example from before, you're going to be saving $1 million a year on your utility bills, and your payments are going to be roughly $1 million, a little under $1 million a year. Usually what happens is that they take that money and move it from the utility budget into the pay back the bank note budget line item, right? So that the ledgers match, or each sides of the ledger match. So you want to make sure you've got your finance folks up to speed early on. You explain to them how this works. And as you get progress and putting together an RFP and getting interest and all that, they understand what's going on, right? Because the timing is key. And we'll talk about that some more later on as to when you put out your RFP for finance. Then there's procurement, right? You want to make sure you do a good, solid, competitive procurement. Your procurement people, your purchasing department, whatever they're called, needs to be involved from the beginning. And in some cases, it's a two-step procedure. And many states, they do a statewide procurement to pre-qualify ESCOs, or energy service companies, so that you have 6 to 10 typically that have blanket contracts that then your Department of Corrections or wastewater or whatever can either select right from that list or do their own competition and basically use only the pre-qualified ESCOs, right? And then once you get the contract negotiated and all that, the procurement people are very helpful. Maintenance people, again, key, absolutely key. And as I mentioned earlier, I come from a family of labor and tradesmen, and my uncles always like to bust me over. Engineers don't know what they're doing. They always screw up our projects, blah, blah, blah. And unfortunately, half the time they are right? Because a lot of engineers don't understand long-term operations and maintenance. And that's what makes this vehicle different, right? Because you're getting folks who actually understand the long-term challenges and benefits of doing things properly. And one of the keys to that is getting the ESCO to work closely with your operations and maintenance folks. The ones turning the wrenches, the ones fixing the things when they go wrong, the ones getting the hot and cold calls. Your project will be successful if they're involved from the beginning, right? And no one will ever know those buildings the way they do. The ESCO will never know them. If you're in management, you of course will never know them. You really want these folks buy-in, right? It also is an incredible career boosting opportunity for maintenance people, operations and maintenance people. In a lot of cases, you end up getting iPads as part of one of these deals, and it really allows them to step up their game and what they're doing for a living, which is great to see. So construction, of course, you're designing construction departments. They're the ones who've been designing and building these buildings for years and years. You absolutely want their assistance in doing this, and witnessing things as they're getting installed, doing peer reviews on designs and so on is absolutely key to success. And then oversight. Now I mentioned this a few times. It's becoming a lot more common. 20 years ago, when I started my firm originally to do this oversight work, there were very few players in the country that did this, but I saw the need for it when I worked for an ESCO in the 90s, and we'd have deals just fall apart, right? We'd spent a year or two developing them, but the owner was like, yeah, I I just can't go forward with this. It's too risky, right? They didn't have anybody there to help them understand this. Sort of like an insurance broker helps you understand these policies before you go and plunk down the money for, to State Farm or Allstate or whoever. A good professional, experienced owner's rep can help you do the same thing, right? And they can actually help you save time, money, and aggravation. Boy, I wish I had them involved in this industry back when I was doing this on the ESCO side, 25 years ago. And last but not least, the approving authorities. So that if you have your own insurance department, your own public works department, construction department that need to approve anything, you need to make sure they're involved in this. Like I know that a lot of our university clients had to go out to Board of Regents to be approved. So you had to not only get approval on campus from the chancellor, wherever, you have to go to literally the state Board of Regents to have these projects approved. So again, often and early, right? For all of these, get your team together early, get everybody trained internally before you really go out to the marketplace. So whose paper should I use? And I mentioned this earlier. Don't use the contracts, the contractor's contract, right? ESC has this model set of instruments you can use. Here's the link for it. And again, they didn't write it. It was a compilation of other states who've been doing this for a long time. So pre-project prep, right? Before you start down the road of one of these, it's going to save you a lot of time and effort. And all of this is part of the education process, right? The first thing is utilities, right? Because this is all about saving utility costs. Assemble your utility bills, right? And again, I'm not going to read all this to you. A lot of states are already using EPA Energy Star's Portfolio Manager, which is great. If you're already using it, you've got a lot of this information you need at your fingertips, as long as it's being kept up to date, right? If it hasn't been kept up to date, that's another issue. But there's also another opportunity out there. There's a lot of providers. They're sometimes called utility bill consolidators that will basically take all of your utility bills, aggregate them, and automatically upload them into Energy Star every month for you. And they'll help you do ACH payments and all that. That's a whole nother issue. You want to know more about it, feel free to reach out. Another thing that just came out about 5-6 years ago at the very bottom here is this thing called DOE's Green Button. This was an initiative because the federal government was doing all these performance contracts, and sometimes it would take months to get utility data out of the utilities. So they worked with, I think there's 40 utilities or 50 utilities now that work with this Green Button, where you can sign into your online account. Virtually every utility account now, you can get an online portal. You sign in and you go to the Green Button portion of it, and it allows you to download either a CSV or an Excel file of everything from your bill: kilowatt hours, KW demand, charges, taxes, fees, everything. It is really tremendous. So check that out if you have time. Next thing is get to understand your bills, right? You want to include, when you put this out into an RFP, a sample bill from each type, so that you really understand what's in it. I mean, that amazes me. I've been doing this for 35 years. I get the bill for my house and I hardly understand it. And I do this for a living, right? So you can imagine people who don't have to look at these all the time. It can be chaos. So that now's the time to dig in. So your folks, especially your energy folks, really understand what's going on, because these bills can be very, very complicated. So here is an incredible helpful tip for doing these kinds of projects. And a lot of this, you'll see there's flags that have been on the top of a couple of these slides. ESC, Energy Services Coalition, created this ESPCU University. It's a whole series of like 10 and 15-minute little podcasts that give you a lot of the details, because this is obviously, right, drinking from a fire hose right now. There's a lot of information, and it's very dense in a short period of time. So you can go to the ESC website under GESPCU, click on it, and on your own time, right? You can, over lunch, whatever, you can sit down and do one of these every couple of days till you really become much more of an expert in the stuff. But this comes from that podcast. And again, I'm not going to read all of these, but it's a lot of these things that you want to try to be familiar with, get copies of electronically, of course, these days, so that when you do get an ESCO on board and they start on your project, they don't spend the first 6 months sending you RFIs or requests for information, right? Because they need all the stuff to do a project. The more you have readily available when you give them notice to proceed with the audit, the quicker this is all going to go, and the better the project will be. So, picking partners, right? I talked a little bit about the owner's reps before. When do you need them? As I mentioned, it has been my experience that earlier is better. You know, I've had clients come to me 3 years after the project has started saying, "Oh, I wish we would brought you in earlier. We're having a problem. Could you come help us fix it?" Right? And nobody wants to be in that position. And what can they help with? Everything from helping you put together the procurement documents at the beginning, assembling that list of data I showed you in the last slide. They can help you with that, help you assemble utility bills, help you educate all the stakeholders in your group from the very beginning. Then as you progress through, do oversight on the ESCO as they do their investment grade audit, as they do designs, they do equipment submittals, all of that. So you either have, an expert independent set of eyes that has no skin in the game, right? We don't get paid as from the ESCO, we get paid by the owner. And where can you find them, right? So it's not a real big pool of these kinds of folks, right? That's something, NASEO and ESC can provide you with a list of folks that do that sort of work. You tend to see sometimes local mechanical engineering firms will sometimes do this. They tend to dabble in it and don't always have the expertise, but there's certainly some firms out there who do this on a daily basis. DOE has also got some insight into that as well. And the value they can provide, like I mentioned before, providing not only oversight, but in checking savings calculations, right? Like, over the years, we have found just mistakes, not malicious or trying to hide anything, just found mistakes in calculations that could have had a material effect on the deal. And you find them before you sign the contract. So there's no no problems trying to unwind a problem during construction or even worse, during the performance period. And how do you find them? Like I said, you can do internet searches or go to NASEO and ESC. And how do you pay for them, right? So this, because they're not getting paid out of the savings, right? They're your consultant. They're typically get paid on a fee for service basis. And what our clients, when I used to do this on a daily basis, they would basically set aside some money, typically out of the utility budget, to pay us up until, say, for the first 9 months till they got the financing in place. Once the financing was in place, they would then borrow that little bit of extra increment to pay for their owner's rep. So it didn't have to come out of their appropriations going forward. And that's usually, a couple percent of the project cost. So it's not a lot. Similar to like if you're hiring a commissioning agent. So what I did include is a link here that you can read. It's just a couple page little brief that Department of Energy did. And actually, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab put this together. A woman named Liz Stewart put this together, and coincidentally, I actually helped her with this. So there's some case studies in there that come from a project I worked on many moons ago for other states. But it'll explain to you in more detail how this all works with an owner's rep. And in fact, there's a Department of Energy has got a working group now called the PCNRC. It's a Performance Contracting National Research Consortium. And what they're trying to do is help states deal with performance contracting issues on a central basis, right? Like they've created a course now to create a certificate for owners reps. And they hired the firm that I used to work for to sort of QA it, so that we've now just about finished putting this together so that you as a state can basically put this course on and get folks that kind of dabble in it more up to speed on how to be an owner's rep. Or if you have internal people who want to be your own owner's rep, they can take this course and get a certificate, right? And there's a link at the end. We'll show you about it. But it is becoming more and more commonplace. I like to tell people that's sort of like where commissioning was 25 years ago. Now you wouldn't think of building a new building without commissioning, where before it was, nobody really heard of it. Picking partners, the energy services company. So how do you select from one of the pre-qualified list of providers? Do you do it from papers anymore? No. Typically, if you already have a pre-qualified list of providers, most of the time I see like an RFQ done by either a state agency or a local government where they already know all the qualifications. So it's very, very brief and then indicative pricing. Typically, you put it out on your standard bid processes, whether it's Demand Star or there's a bunch of systems out there now. You always want to include references and check references for sure, because again, this is a complex scenario. You want to make sure you understand the markups, as I mentioned earlier. You can provide them with little spreadsheet templates that show the breakdown of overhead, profit, engineering, so on and so forth. And what sort of safety factors are they including in it, right? Because typically these ESCOs are going to calculate the savings using their engineering formulas, and then usually guarantee a percentage of that, right? Usually it's between 90 and 100%, because they know that they're going to calculate the savings for the lights being on so many hours, and they've put loggers in to test it all out, but it can always be a little bit different. So they're going to usually guarantee, say, 95% of what they've calculated. It includes a little buffer in there. And it's usually a little bit lower for HVAC and controls and so on. And that all kind of creates a comfort factor, right? Which is good, right? You don't want them to guarantee exactly what the calculation is, because if one or two things go wrong or is different, it ends up being a default, and then you get into legal stuff, which nobody wants to be in. It's good to have a little bit of a headroom in the deals. So your financier, how do you select one? It's a similar sort of process with an ESCO. You want to find out, and typically these aren't on a standard pre-qualified list, but usually most states already have one on board, or they have experience with ones in the past, right? And most state agencies and local governments have more experience hiring financial advisors than ESCOs. So in many cases, they follow the same process they would with interviews and references and so on. One thing that's different about picking an ESCO, I think, that I want to point out is that no matter how good everybody looks on paper, right, you want to make sure that you do interviews, right? And then they used to be all in person. Now they tend to be done through Zoom, sometimes a combination. But for me, having sat through dozens and dozens of these, there's nothing like meeting the people in person if you can, and being able to look them in the eye, knowing these are the people that are going to work on my project for the next 2 years, versus some suit from Minneapolis or Chicago who's going to fly in and try to close the deal. You want to require that people are going to be working for you at those interviews, right? And I've seen ESCOs literally thrown out of the room because they didn't comply with that request, right? So that's key for me. It all comes down to the people, and I've worked over the years with all the major ESCOs, and they vary in quality from office to office because it comes down to the people, right? So you want to make sure you understand who's going to be working on your project. That is absolutely key. So investment grade audits, I've alluded to this multiple times throughout the presentation. So this is basically the due diligence, right? The detailed survey or audit that is done of all the facilities that are being included in your project, right? And again, there's a whole other section of this in the GSPCU that you can go and learn more about. But basically, it is a study, right? It's not really a proposal. You're going to get a proposal as a result of it, but it's a study that says, right, here's all the buildings you asked us to take a look at. Here are the ideas that we got both from your internal folks, right? A lot of times your design, construction, operation, and maintenance people already know some of the things that need to get done. And here you're getting an outside validation of it, and often some new and different ideas, because these folks do this every day. And you kind of get flesh it out. And when I was doing this on a day-to-day basis, we would require 30, 60, 90% submissions. So instead of them just showing up 6 months later with a finished study, we would do like you would do with a new building design, right? You don't build a building from 100% plans, right? You build a building from, you do programming first, then you do schematic drawings, then design development drawings, then construction drawings, and then you bid and build the building, right? You would never just go from 0 to 100, right? That doesn't give you a chance to do incremental decision making. Maybe this isn't really working the way we had hoped. Let's throw out that measure. Let's add this one in. It really makes a much better process to do it in an incremental decision making methodology, right? At the end, you'll get a proposal that says, okay, we've agreed to all these measures. Here's how much it costs, and here's how much it's going to save, right? And you're going to get those economics as you go through the process. And at the end, the proposal will be, here's how much the maintenance and all of that financing costs are going to be. And then you'll know really what the deal is going to look like, right? You're also going to want to make sure you get this technical support from your third party or your in-house people to review all the savings calculations, M&V plan, and so on, and make sure it's something that's readable. Again, we require this when I used to do this all the time, that this is in plain English, so you don't need to have a law degree nor an engineering degree to understand the audit. And then what's the real value of pre-project description? It's priceless, right? Because once you change everything, you won't have anything to go back and look at. So you want to know that your ESCO has been through your buildings and reflected back to you a description of what's in them, how they operate, and how they're maintained. And if they've given you a pretty accurate description, that's a really good sign that you're going to have a very successful project, right? And things like load studies, right? You know, how many tons of air conditioning and pounds of steam do we need to heat this building? Well, that's key to this, right? You don't want to just take everything out and replace it in kind, because it may not have worked that way, right? So there's things like that you want to make sure are included in your investment grade audit. And the baseline I've mentioned before, right? The baseline that's created around these buildings is a snapshot of how these buildings were designed, how they're operating, and how they're being maintained from a technical point of view. Then also from a financial point of view, where's all the money being spent? So the baseline is a compilation of the technical descriptions and your utility costs, your utility usage and your costs, and how that gets apportioned. So then you know, okay, where are these savings coming from? Okay, well, if it's a K through 12 school district, the high school obviously uses the most. They tend to be the biggest. They tend to have the summer school, the sports, all that you typically are not going to have in an elementary school, right? So it's that sort of thing. Then the standards of comfort I mentioned earlier, assessing the roles and risks, right? So what are the rates, right? That's one nice thing. You work with an ESCO, and as you're getting towards this like 90%, they can start running these cash flow pro formas I mentioned earlier that shows, all right, if we're going to do a 15-year deal, we know it's going to be about $10 million. If it's a 2% escalation rate, what does the economics look like? If it's 2.5% escalation rate, what do the economics look like? If we borrow money like soon at 3% versus in December at 4%, what does it look like, right? And so showing how those rates change can really have a massive impact on your deal, right? And because no one has control over those rates, they all get agreed to. Like I said, with the escalation rate, and of course the finance rate all gets agreed to at the very beginning. Same thing with maintenance and operations. Who's going to really operate and maintain this equipment that was installed? You know, 90% of the time, it tends to be the existing folks who are doing it now, but with this training that I mentioned earlier, and usually having them involved in commissioning, right? So they can do some witnessing of the commissioning of the project. And then if there's any material changes in the use, hours, and occupancy, right? Like I mentioned earlier, buildings are always changing, right? There's nothing you can do about that. None of them are static. But there's baseline adjustment language that's included in these well-written contracts that protects you, the owner, in case of a change, right? So it allows you to know going, 5 years down the road, you don't have, of course, you have to worry about, are people leaving things on all weekend? Yes, you have to worry about that, but you don't have to worry about, big brother looking over your shoulder that this building must be operating at 72 degrees, right? There's a bandwidth of that throughout the project, and then all gets explained in the measurement and verification plan, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the IJ defines the scope of the measure, right? We're going to take out these fluorescent lamps and put in LEDs, right? With a lot more description around it. It's going to describe how all the equipment gets started up, how it gets commissioned. And one of the things that I really like about ESPC versus standard construction is you get real commissioning, right? Because this ESCO has got skin in the game. And a lot of other projects I've seen that are design bid builds, even some design build, the commissioning is a bit of an oversight, a lot of boxes being checked. I call it faux commissioning, because there's no recourse if it doesn't happen, right? And with a performance contract, there's a lot of recourse, right? If the things aren't commissioned properly and the savings aren't achieved, that ESCO is writing you a check, right? Literally writing you a check. If they're promising you that $1 million a year in savings that I mentioned earlier, and they only come in with 900, they're writing you a check for $100,000, right? And then they have to fix the problem so it doesn't occur again, right? So there's a lot of onus on the ESCO to make sure this stuff happens properly, and commissioning is one of the best tools they have. And then measurement verification, as I'd mentioned earlier, that is key, and it's done on a measure by measure basis, right? So that lighting will be done differently than HVAC, which will be done differently than controls, which will be done different than solar and battery storage, right? It's going to give you an idea of the projected savings, like I said, the calculated savings, and then the guaranteed savings, which may be between 90 and 100% of what they calculated, the safety factors, the operations and maintenance savings. It's like I mentioned, if you're taking out a bunch of ancient rooftops or ancient chillers and boilers and replacing them with brand new equipment with a 5-year or 10-year warranty, your maintenance costs have now gone down by 75%, right? And that's real savings. But it all has to be documented, especially when it comes to maintenance savings. Like we usually never allow labor savings, right? Because most public entities already don't have enough people to operate and maintain what they have. They're certainly not going to lay somebody off because they've got a new chiller plant. If that person doesn't have enough to do there, they'll be redirected, right, to do other stuff. Like instead of putting out fires all day long and driving around in their pickup truck, they actually get to do predictive maintenance, which is what they were trained to do. So that really is helpful. You can take a look at future capital cost avoidance, but if this gets done and tries to get sort of slid in sometimes, but you really only want to do that if you have this in your budget, right? If you know that, oh, we're eventually going to replace those windows 5 years from now, the chances of that happening are pretty remote, right? You've seen this all, I'm sure, things just getting pulled from your budget request. So you don't want to include that unless it is in that next year's budget. Then you can include it as a capital cost avoidance. So if you can't prove it, you can't claim it. And then the M&V plan, and I could spend a ton of time talking about this, but this is an intro to it. But this is the absolute key and linchpin to a successful performance contract, is making sure you have a robust, comprehensive, transparent measurement verification plan that is written in English. So again, you don't have to be an absolute expert to understand some of the stuff that's in it. Yes, it's very specific to M&V knowledge, but the introductions and the explanations need to be written in plain English. And you want to make sure your owner's rep, who's usually the expert in this, reviews these things in detail. And again, when I was doing this a lot, we'd require M&V plans starting from 30, 60, and 90%, and they would get more fleshed out as time went on. So there wasn't any surprises at the end, right? So that really worked well. Then finally you get this proposal, right? It's going to be typically the investment grade audit results all included in a proposal, right? And this gets done in various different ways all over the country, but all of the measures are included, the construction plan, right? How they're going to get this done, who are the subs, making sure that none of those subs are on your blacklist, right? That all gets done at the beginning. And a lot of them, the smart ones, are going to ask you, who do you like to use that knows your buildings already? And that will go to them, right? Typically, and make sure they get to bid on things. Then the commissioning plan, the M&V plan. Some of the things that are most important about this are the pricing, right? And I've already talked about all these other options, term, they're typically 15 years. The pricing, and we don't have time to get into details of this, but you want to make sure you see what the subcontractor costs are, what the overhead and profit are, what the commissioning fees, engineering fees, training fees, all of that done on an open book basis. And it's basically a guaranteed maximum price, right? And once they've got that guaranteed maximum price, that's it. If there's something that ESCO has missed during the development, they can't come back and ask you for more money, right? You've all agreed to the scope of work. So it's, again, another beautiful thing about this. There are no change orders in performance contracting. Unless you as the owner request one, there are no change orders, right? We talked about guaranteed savings already. I already talked about open book pricing. Then the cash flow, I told you that lays it all out in a 15-year term. Then the energy services agreement includes the whole IGA. Typically, you want to make sure that's incorporated either by reference or physically. You provide the terms and conditions, all the standard stuff, events of default, insurance, force majeure, all that stuff that's in any construction project. Provides for an order of precedence. It defines the purchase of services. You're going to incorporate the finance agreement typically to make sure that everyone understands what the finances look like, and defines the billing and payment procedures. Right, that's key, because this is going to be payments over a 15-year term. The non-appropriation clause, we already talked about. Construction guidance. You may have your own specific construction contract that gets included as a schedule, like I mentioned earlier. And then post-construction services, right? Once that gets installed and commissioned, right? And you only accept these projects and start making the payments upon acceptance. So again, as very different from design bid build, where they show up with the steel on the site, you're paying 30%, right? They erect the steel, you're paying another 20%. They slap the windows on, you're paying another percent. You don't ever know if that building's really going to work, right? With these deals, you don't pay a penny to the ESCO directly until you accept that project, right? They're going to be making draws to pay the subcontractors as the construction is being completed, typically 12 to 18 months, and your financier, right, who's holding the money, is going to be giving those draws, right? They submit the payment request every month, you review it, your owner's rep reviews it, everyone approves it, they get paid. But the city, town, or state agency hasn't paid a penny out of their pocket yet. Only once that is completed and accepted, then typically 30 to 60 days later, do you get your first invoice. All right, so you can see how just when you follow the money, it drives an increased attention to detail and standard of care that you do not see in standard public construction, right? Which is a beautiful thing from my perspective. And then the responsibilities of the parties, right? That's going to be laid out in detail. We have this thing called a risk responsibility matrix that we took from all the Department of Energy work we used to do, and we put that into every state contract that we work on, or local government as well. And then I'm not going to go over all these, but these are typically all the schedules that are included as exhibits to these contracts. And I've mentioned virtually all of these already. The design and construction phase, post-construction, you know, the ESCO's maintenance responsibilities, institutions' maintenance responsibilities. These are two of the keys that need to be made sure are clear, that everybody understands. Because when I've been brought in to do forensic analysis on deals that have gone bad a few times, this was one of the issues. It was M&V not being understood by the owner, and the maintenance not being done properly by the owner's maintenance staff, right? So you want to make sure everybody on your staff understands this, and the ESCO has trained them properly. And then the administrative parts of it, there's like alternative dispute resolution procedures. That's much more common than it used to be, right? The industry started to get away from it for a while. Now it's coming back to it. So you can have, you know, arbitration as opposed to going to court. And then there's optional schedules you can include in there, you know, Energy Star reports, whatever, facility change checklists. If you know there's going to be upcoming capital projects, you may want to include those as well. And then a lot of these start to look like regular construction attachments. So some process considerations. Whose process is it, right? This is your process, right? Even though an ESCO is acting as the single implementer, this is still your process using your rules and your regs, right? So you're going to follow your submittal process. You're going to give them a notice to proceed just like you would do on a normal construction project. That's typically done after the IGA is completed, the proposal's been accepted, you've got all of your approvals internally, and the money has been sourced and deposited into an account. Then you're allowed to sign the contract, give them a notice to proceed, and you get going. And then they typically will finish up the design, get going into construction and so on. You want to spend a lot of time in the construction planning and sequencing. Always require, you know, a Gantt chart style project schedule, especially if you're in buildings that are occupied. You know, all of these, this all gets done in occupied buildings, right? This is, again, another beautiful thing about this industry is the ESCOs are used to working in occupied schools, hospitals, office buildings, whatever, and do most of the work second and third shift. And certainly some things like summer shutdowns in schools, you're going to want to replace your boiler plant kind of thing, right? But in most cases, it's all done during the common year. construction meetings and minutes, all of this. This all looks a lot like what you do in your standard construction process. Then the invoicing gets done typically on an annual, quarterly, or monthly basis, typically in a percent complete during construction. Excuse me, the invoicing for construction gets done on a monthly basis, like I said, with the draws and all that. And then the payments afterwards get done on a quarterly or annual basis. Punch lists, again, much like your standard punch lists, except now you've got a lot more of a stick to be able to make sure this stuff is completed, because you're not going to accept that project till everything is actually done, right? So it's really a much better process, I think. Then you get to your final completion, closeout documentation, all those stuff that you expect, and make sure you get those as-built documents, right? That's key. Then post-construction services, the ESCOs will provide, typically, if they're not doing the operations and maintenance, they're going to provide the training and some oversight. Usually on a quarterly basis, they'll ask you to provide you with your chiller logs, boiler logs, maintenance logs, and all that, to make sure that the stuff that everyone's agreed to is actually getting done. Reporting any material changes. So you may have, put as Dale used, and when he did this for West Virginia a couple of weeks ago, a new art wing on a school that put in 10 electric kilns. Next thing you know, the electric bill went through the roof, right? Or you added onto a building at a hospital, right? Things like this. Those are the kinds of things you want to report to the ESCO, depending on how their measurement verification is being done. It could affect that M&V and affect the savings, right? There's warranty support that gets done. It gets done in all different kinds of ways. Post-construction M&V, right? Because it's their responsibility to make sure that those savings are actually being achieved by statute, by contract, for the life of the project. One of the keys to doing this is
close to time, so if you could please wrap up, so we have a little bit of time for Eileen to provide a couple comments.
All right. Too. Thanks. Okay. Annual M&V reports get done on an annual basis to make sure they're actually saving you the money that you've been promised. So here's a recap. I've already gone through all of this, so we're not going to recap. So where do you save all this, right? And I've been through this in every way you can imagine of trying to save it, and everything from file cabinets to spreadsheets. There's a new product out there that the Department of Energy through LB&L has put out called eProject Express. Some of you may have heard of it already. Myself and Dale are trainers for ESC and LBL on this. And this is a hugely powerful tool, right? And we don't have time to go into it now, but here is a list of the training sessions. There's going to be one in a few weeks, July 11th, focused on K-12 schools. The 8th focused on local governments, and the 12th focused on benefits for SEOs. Hugely powerful tool where you can put all of this stuff that I've talked about into a free offsite cloud storage, which is amazing. I can't tell you how many times you run into problems where you just can't find things, right? We've already talked about the GESPCU. And this all sounds maybe a little too hard, right? It's very complicated. Like I said, it's drinking from a fire hose, but $7 or $8 billion a year of this gets done, right? All across the country. Like I said, 100 million has been done just in 12, 15 years in Missouri alone. It's been getting done for 50 years. And there's an army of people out there to help you. How long will it take? This typically 12 months to 2 years. You start seeing the savings typically during construction, but they're not guaranteed typically until you start getting into those annual performance years. And how's this going to impact my day-to-day mission? Like we say in this business, you want this as transparent as possible. So if nobody noticed the lighting was changed, great. And that is what these ESCOs strive for. And you do not lose control of the process, especially if you have some outside help. It really makes for a much better process than your standard design bid build. And you will be able to make changes, right? It's not like you're fixed with this. As time goes on, like I mentioned earlier, there's these baseline adjustments that can be done and get written into the contract so everyone knows the process. Here's a whole bunch of resources. Again, if we had more time, we'd go into it. This is the PCNRC, and there's one that Dale put together just for state and local governments. That's the PCNRC for you, eProject Builders, where EPX is housed. And that is pretty much it. So sorry I went over a bit there.
All right, thanks so much, Chris. Really appreciate that presentation. So I know we do have a Missouri-specific speaker on here, so I'm going to make Eileen O'Hara, who is standing in for Chris Salzman, available to speak. So Eileen, are you there? You should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm here. And Sam, can you hear me all?
Yes.
Okay, and Sam, can you just add to the next slide, please, from Chris?
Sure, hang on just a second. I'll share my screen.
And while you're doing that, everyone, as Chris Halpin, that was such an excellent presentation. You talked about ESCOs have to be partners and they have, let's see, one neck to choke. Well, I think in this instance, we've had my colleague, Chris, has had one neck to choke and he's going and being properly choked and we're helping through another client. So that's why I'm here talking. I work as well with ESP and I do a lot of work on energy awareness and warranty support, as Chris said. So I've been intimately involved with some of these projects. We have been across Missouri for over 15 years. We've had large scale projects at Truman State. We've had smaller scale projects at rural schools. And one of the things that we like to do is, as Chris mentioned, is looking to leverage all avenues in order to get the savings for these schools. And it's key that we found, in particular in Missouri, is building those relationships. And I know with many other folks on the call, it's the same thing as the jobs that they have done. So next slide. I'll just be very brief. I wanted to talk about one small school district we work with, Northwood, which is a pre-K to 8th grade, and it's in Salem and it's in the rural towns. And one of the things, even though with this great presentation, it sounds so complex, we found that the vehicle was very helpful because our discussion with them, they had a lot of long deferred needs. 1961 original construction, they had a lot of energy needs as well. So for our particular project, we were able to collaborate. And I just want to end that note on this whole 2-hour training is that key of those relationships, working with the district, their financial advisor to find the way to get the multiple improvements from them. So the EPC, as we tend to call it, has got that flexibility for the energy savings, utility rebates, capital contributions, and levy contributions. All of that together helped pay for a $1.4 million project for this small school. It was HVAC, lighting, controls, an ADA lift, some roof repairs, and so on. The point is that all of this working together on this vehicle helped. And then we, as a small independent ESCO, were there along the way, and I have still been there. We completed M&V, and I concur with Chris so much on terms of training for folks. We need to have training on controls. Who gets good training on controls since it's finished at the end? And that has been an ongoing thing that I help the maintenance staff. In fact, the one maintenance person there. As you all recall, from February of 2021, the perfect storm, one of the things we were involved with was being in touch with our clients, being aware of the impact of that on their systems. So we take it seriously to stay involved. And so for us, this whole process has been very satisfying. And we believe for this small rural district that this is a good vehicle to use to work with them to get a lot accomplished, to be transparent, as Chris had said, to conduct M&V, to have local jobs. We work with local contractors, often having to educate them on submittal processes and on taking baseline measurements in order to do proper M&V and so forth. We work together. And with all of that, we are doing that education. So it has been, just as a note, a really, I think, satisfying approach, and we work with other small districts and large districts, but it is something that we have felt is a definite vehicle, and we look forward to continuing to do that in Missouri.
All right, thank you so much, Eileen. Really appreciate that. Before we do leave, we do have one quick question here in the Q&A box for Chris. And the question was, and I'm not sure, Chris, if you managed to get this on a couple of slides, but can you talk about a deeper retrofits that upgrade the building envelope, such as insulation, windows, or air penetration? And then how can ESPC make these improvements possible to achieve net zero goals?
I would love to. Thank you. A great question. So that's actually something that's near and dear to my heart, because building envelope stuff like that has been overlooked for a long time. People thought it was like, oh, well, caulk the windows and put sweeps under the doors, where there's so much more to it than that. And promoting deep retrofits is one of the ways to do it, right? And so what we're starting to see more and more of is, if you've heard of commercial blower door tests, are showing that you can actually go in and really fully seal buildings for like a 3-year payback, and really find out where all the leaks are. And I've seen things where the walls didn't meet the roof for like 60 feet long, holes and things that you just couldn't tell otherwise, right? So one of the ways to make all this work, and I talked about it earlier, is trying to throw some cash in at the beginning, because some of these things that you want to try to do a truly deep retrofit, like a lot of times you'd see in the past, the ESCO says, right, we can replace your controls, right? But there isn't enough savings to replace the actuators and the dampers and so on. So you end up putting, brand new controls onto 40-year-old dampers and actuators, right? And that's the difference between a deep retrofit and a standard performance contract. So you contribute a little bit of money, or in this case, like I said, you can go to 15 years. If your deal will pencil in 13 years, go to 15, right? That's actually the sweet spot of the financial market. And this whole business is 15 years, 15, 16 years. Then you can afford to put the extra money in to really make it a true deep retrofit. All right. And that's one thing I tell everybody too. Solar is great. It's very sexy, but it's very expensive, even though it's much cheaper than it used to be. If you want to do solar on your buildings, make sure your building is as efficient as it can be before you even think about putting solar on it. Right. And blending streams. I told you, not just taking cash, but getting as many incentives as you can, lining up this federal money that's coming, learn as much about that as you possibly can. And do it in a way that you have your ESCO, like the young lady that just spoke, they want to do this for you, right? Because they are incentivized to do comprehensive projects. That's how they make money. That's how I did it when I worked for an ESCO. So they don't want to do anything cheap and dirty. They want to do a good, robust, comprehensive project for you. So the more tools you give your ESCO to work with, and in this case, it's financial tools, the better off you'll be, and the deeper the retrofit can happen. We've had a couple of projects where this, the signs all came together, and we got like 45% savings, I believe, in one building. And any of you ever heard of the Rocky Mountain Institute? Look it up. They're based in Colorado. They're a nonprofit sort of think tank, think and do tank, they call themselves. They have a whole section on deep energy retrofits. And they help the U.S. Department of General Services Administration do deep retrofits on 50 GSA buildings around the country using performance contracting. So there's some good case studies there. And if you have any other questions, I'm happy to follow up with you afterwards, but hopefully that answered your question. Did it answer your question?
Yep.
Okay.
So in this case, we are a little bit over time. So wanted to just say, thank you everybody for joining us today for this training. We're really glad you were able to make it. I hope you learned a lot. And a big thank you to Chris from ESC for the huge help in assisting us and putting together some great content here. And also big thanks to Eileen for being able to step in with Chris and talk about some of their projects in Missouri. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you for the time.
Happy 4th.
And sorry for going over.